Otis and Lenora had been married for 58 years. They had never spent a night apart, not once. Then their children, citing different care needs, placed Otis in a facility in Ohio and Lenora in another in Pennsylvania, 200 miles apart. Otis stopped eating. Lenora stopped speaking. For 4 months they existed, but they didn't live. Then, one morning, Otis's bed was empty. 3 days later, Lenora's bed was empty. Their children panicked. The police searched, but Otis and Lenora were already together, in a place nobody would ever think to look. To understand where they went and what they built when they got there, you have to go back to the beginning, back to Buckner Street. Otis and Lenora Hayes lived in a 2-story colonial with green shutters in Canton, Ohio. Otis had repainted those shutters every 5 years since 1969, and the porch was his handiwork too, wide and deep, with a railing he'd carved by hand. Lenora kept window boxes of geraniums in the summer and electric candles in the windows come December. From the street, the house looked like what it was, a place where 2 people had spent a lifetime caring for each other and for the things around them. Otis had been a carpenter for more than 4 decades. He worked for a construction outfit until his knees gave him trouble, then freelanced out of the garage building bookshelves and kitchen cabinets for people around town. His hands were thick and scarred, the knuckles swollen from decades of hammers and saws. Those hands never sat idle. If he wasn't building something for a neighbor, he was fixing something for Lenora. A loose cabinet hinge, a creaky step, the screen door that never quite latched right. "Otis, you fixed that door last month," Lenora would say. "It's sticking again," he'd answer. They both knew it wasn't. He just needed something to do with his hands. Lenora had taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for 3.5 decades. She was the teacher parents requested by name, the one who stayed late for the kids who couldn't read yet and showed up early with snacks for the ones who came to school hungry. After she retired, she channeled that energy into the block. She ran the 4th of July potluck every summer and kept a mental inventory of every neighbor's birthday, anniversary, and dietary restriction. Together, they ran like a single clock. Otis made the coffee at 5:30 every morning, black for him, 1 sugar for her. Lenora made dinner at 6 every evening except Fridays when Otis grilled. They walked to the mailbox together, weeded the garden together, sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the light change over the rooftops. After more than half a century, they didn't need to talk much. They'd covered most of the important subjects already. What remained was the comfort of being beside the one person who knew everything about you and stayed anyway. They had 3 children. Darren, the eldest, worked in real estate development out of Columbus. Janet was a dental hygienist who lived about 40 minutes away with her husband and 2 teenage sons. Their youngest had moved to Oregon long ago and called on holidays. Darren was the one who started it. Otis fell off a ladder in September, trying to clean the gutters. He'd climbed that same ladder for decades, but his hip had been bothering him all summer, and this time his foot slipped on the 3rd run. He hit the driveway hard, cracked his hip, bruised 3 ribs, spent 2 weeks at the hospital. Lenora drove herself to the emergency room that afternoon, even though she'd been having trouble with roots lately. She'd missed the highway exit twice in the past month and left the stove on 3 times since June. Small lapses. The kind that happened to plenty of people her age, nothing a reminder note on the fridge couldn't handle. But together, they compensated. Otis couldn't move well anymore, but he could remember everything. Lenora's memory wandered, but she was strong and steady on her feet. His legs were failing, her recall was slipping. Combined, they made one whole person. They'd been doing that quiet negotiation for a long time, each one covering for the other without discussing it, and it worked. They were managing. Their children didn't see it that way. 2 weeks after Otis came home from the hospital with a walker and a physical therapy schedule, Darren called a family meeting. He drove down from Columbus on a Saturday morning with a folder full of brochures and a plan that was already decided. Janet came too. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap, not meeting anyone's eyes. Darren spread the brochures across the table, glossy photographs of smiling seniors playing bingo, eating in bright dining halls, sitting in manicured gardens. "Dad, Mom, we need to talk about next steps," Darren said. "Next steps for what?" Otis asked. "For your care, both of you." He opened the first brochure. "This is Shady Oaks in Akron. They specialize in mobility rehabilitation, physical therapy every day, nursing staff around the clock. It's exactly what you need, Dad." Otis looked at the brochure. He didn't pick it up. I have therapy here. The hospital arranged it. A therapist comes to the house 3 times a week. Darren opened the second brochure. And this is Meadowview, outside Scranton. They have a specialized memory care unit. Their staff is trained for early-stage cognitive decline. The kitchen went still. Lenora set her coffee cup down slowly. Memory care, she said. You're talking about me. Mom, it's not like that. You think I need a facility because I left the stove on. It's more than the stove. You got lost driving to the grocery store last month, a store you've been going to for 3 decades. I found my way home, Lenora said. Her voice was steady, but Otis saw her hand trembling against the table. This time, Darren said. Otis leaned forward in his chair. Your mother and I are fine. We take care of each other. We've been doing that since before you were born. That's the problem, Dad. You can't take care of each other anymore. You can barely walk. And Mom can barely careful, Otis said. Just the one word. But it landed heavy in the room. Darren took a breath, looked at Janet. Janet studied her hands. Those facilities are in 2 different states, Lenora said. She'd read the addresses upside down across the table. She was good at that, reading things people thought she couldn't see. Akron and Scranton, that's 200 miles apart. They have different specialties, Mom. Dad needs mobility care. You need memory support. There isn't one facility that does both at the level you'd need. Different care needs. Otis would hear that phrase so many times in the coming weeks that the words would lose all meaning. Just sounds, a label somebody invented to make an ugly decision sound medical. What about the house? Otis asked. Darren straightened the brochures, aligned their edges with his fingertips. Darren, what about the house? We found a buyer, young family relocating for work. They're offering $320,000. That's what Darren had calculated his parents' home was worth, the house where Otis had raised 3 children. The porch he'd built with his own hands, the kitchen table he'd refinished on a Saturday while Lenora kept his coffee warm. Lenora looked at Otis. Otis looked at the table. You're selling our home, Lenora said. The maintenance costs a fortune, Mom. The roof needs work. The furnace is ancient. Property taxes went up again. You're not using most of the rooms. It makes sense to sell while the market's strong and put the money toward your care. Janet cleared her throat. It really is a nice facility, Mom. I toured Meadowview myself. The rooms are bright and the staff seemed caring. They really did. Janet, Lenora said, Did you know about all this before today? Janet's face answered the question before her mouth could. How long? A few weeks. Darren thought it would be better if we presented it together. Otis gripped the handles of his walker and pulled himself up from the table. The effort showed in his face, the strain in his jaw, and he could see Darren watching it, cataloging every wince, every tremor, building his case. Sit down, Dad. We're not done. I'm done, Otis said. You decided before you walked through that door. He was right. The buyer had already been contacted. The facilities had already reserved beds. The intake paperwork was in Darren's briefcase, sitting in the car. Darren had planned this like one of his development projects. Identify the asset, calculate the value, execute the transaction. Clean, efficient, done. What Otis didn't know, what nobody in that kitchen knew except Darren, was that he needed the money. 2 of his development deals had gone sideways in the past 18 months. He owed contractors. He owed the bank. His parents' house, owned outright, no mortgage, represented the fastest equity he could get his hands on. The different care needs rationale was real enough to hold up under scrutiny, but it wasn't the reason. The closing happened in under 3 weeks. Movers arrived on a Tuesday and started boxing up the house. Otis sat in his recliner and watched strangers wrap Lenora's china in sheets of newspaper. Lenora walked through the emptying rooms, touching the walls, the door frames, the windowsills she'd wiped down 10,000 times. They kept what they could carry. The rest was donated, sold, or hauled to the dump. Darren's crew cleared the garage workshop last, tossing Otis's tools into cardboard boxes without sorting them. Chisels mixed with drill bits, clamps tangled with sandpaper. The leather tool belt, the one Lenora's father had given Otis the year they got married, ended up in a donation bin at the curb. Lenora found Otis standing in the empty garage, staring at the oil stain on the concrete where his workbench had stood for decades. Otis, they threw the belt away, he said. The one your father gave me. She took his arm. I know. He didn't fight the sale. He didn't fight the move. That surprised everyone, including Lenora. But she knew her husband. Otis was not a man who wasted energy on fights he couldn't win in the moment. When other men swore at a stuck bolt or kicked a jammed door, Otis stopped, thought, and tried from a different angle. She didn't know what angle he was working yet, but she knew he was working one. Separation Day was a Thursday in late October. Gray sky, no wind, 42 degrees. 2 vans arrived at the house at 9 in the morning. A white one for Otis, a blue one for Lenora, different companies, different directions. The drivers were polite and efficient. They loaded the small bags, checked the paperwork, confirmed the destinations. Otis stood in the driveway with his walker. He wore his good brown coat, the one Lenora had given him for their 50th anniversary. Lenora stood beside him in her blue cardigan holding a small overnight bag. Inside were her nightgown, her medications, one change of clothes, and Otis's old flannel shirt, the red one he wore around the house on weekends. She'd pulled it from the laundry basket that morning before Darren's crew could box it up. Darren stood by his car with his arms crossed, waiting for this to be over. Janet stood at the end of the driveway, crying. "Lenora," Otis said. He kept his eyes forward, looking at the house one last time. If he turned to face her, he wouldn't be able to let her go, and he needed her to believe he was letting go. "I know," she said. She didn't look at him either. "I'll call you every day, she said. The white van driver slid the door open. "Mr. Hayes, we're ready when you are." Otis turned to Lenora then. He took her hand, the same hand he'd held at their wedding at 3 hospital bedsides when their children were born, on 1,000 evening walks around the block. He held it and said, "This isn't over." She squeezed his fingers. "I know." Then the drivers helped them into their vans. Otis into the white one heading west toward Akron. Lenora into the blue one heading east toward Scranton. As the van pulled away from Buckner Street, Otis pressed his palm flat against the back window. He watched the house getting smaller, watched Janet waving from the driveway, watched Darren climb into his car without looking back. And he watched the blue van carrying Lenora turn right at the highway interchange while his van turned left. 200 miles now stood between them. After a lifetime of never spending a night apart, after more than half a century of reaching across the mattress in the dark and finding each other there, 200 miles of highway and hills and strangers' lives. Otis kept his hand on the glass until the interchange disappeared behind a bend in the road. Then he lowered it to his lap. He flexed his thick, scarred carpenter's fingers, and he began to plan. Shady Oaks sat on the east side of Akron, a 3-story brick building behind a parking lot and a strip of brown grass. Otis arrived that Thursday afternoon with his walker, his small bag, and the plan still forming in the back of his mind. The intake nurse was a young woman with a clipboard. She fastened a plastic wristband around his wrist, checked his medications, and walked him to his room on the 2nd floor. Room 214, a single bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a window facing the parking lot. "Dinner's at 5:30 in the common room," she said. "Bingo at 7. Press the call button if you need anything." Otis sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. A man was crossing the parking lot with a bag of fast food. Otis watched him walk inside and not come back out. That first night, he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The mattress was too soft. The room smelled like industrial cleaner, and the space beside him was empty. He reached across the bed out of habit, the way he had every night for 58 years, and found nothing. Just cold sheets and the low hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway. He stopped eating 3 days in. It wasn't a decision he made consciously. His body just refused. The cafeteria tray sat on his nightstand going cold while he stared at the parking lot. The staff tried. A nutritionist came. An activities coordinator invited him to woodworking group, which was really just pre-sanded birdhouse kits and white glue. "Mr. Hayes, you need to eat something," the head nurse said on day 5. "I'm not hungry. Your daughter called. She's worried about you." "Which daughter?" "Janet. Tell her I'm fine." He wasn't fine. His hands sat in his lap idle for the first time in his adult life. There was nothing to fix in this place, nothing to build. The walls were drywall he could punch through. The furniture was laminated particle board, and the window didn't even open all the way. 200 miles east, Lenora sat in a room that looked almost identical to his. Same bed, same nightstand, same window. Hers faced a garden with a bird feeder which was supposed to be calming. She didn't notice. She stopped speaking on the 2nd day. The nurses wrote it up as withdrawal. Consulted the psychiatrist, adjusted her medications. They added an anti-anxiety pill in the morning and a sleep aid at night. Within a week, Lenora was sleeping 14 hours a day, shuffling through hallways with her eyes half closed, sitting in the common room without looking at anyone. The flannel shirt stayed pressed against her chest. She'd folded it into a tight square and tucked it inside her cardigan against her ribs. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and the coffee Otis brewed every morning. "Mrs. Hayes, would you like to join Arts and Crafts?" a nurse asked. Lenora looked through her. Mrs. Hayes, nothing. The one thing that still connected them was the telephone. The facility allowed one supervised call per week, 15 minutes, Tuesdays at 2 in the afternoon. The first call was the worst. Otis sat in the common room holding the receiver, listening to the click and hum of the connection going through. Then Lenora's voice came through, thin and far away. "Otis, I'm here. Are you eating? Some. Are you talking to people?" A pause. "I'm talking to you. The nurses say you've gone quiet. I don't have anything to say to them." Otis closed his eyes. He could picture her in a room just like his, holding his old shirt, staring at a wall. "Lenora, listen to me. I need you to eat. I need you to talk to the staff. I need you to keep going." "Why?" He gripped the phone tighter. "Because this isn't over. I told you that. We're in separate states. The house is gone. The children decided. This isn't over," he said again. Silence. Then, quietly, "Okay." The second call was shorter. Lenora's voice was flat, muffled by whatever medication they'd added. Otis asked about her room, the food, the garden outside her window. She answered in single words. "Yes. No. Fine. Are you sleeping?" "They give me pills. I sleep a lot. Too much. I can't tell the difference between Tuesday and Saturday anymore. Tell them you don't want the sleep medication. I don't control the pills. Otis. They put them in a cup and I take them." Third call, she told him about a woman down the hall who cried every night. Fourth call, she mentioned the bird feeder outside her window had been empty for a week and nobody had refilled it. By the fifth call, her voice had a little more life in it. She'd started walking the hallways in the mornings before the pills kicked in. Then, Darren made a phone call of his own. He called the facility on a Monday and spoke with the director. He said the weekly calls were emotionally destabilizing for both parents. He recommended a pause to allow them to adjust independently to their new environments. The director, who dealt with family dynamics every day and had learned to defer to the adult children who signed the payment agreements, agreed. The next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Otis sat in the common room and waited for the call. It didn't come. He waited until 3. He asked the nurse at the desk. "Your son requested a pause on phone contact," she said. "He felt it was interfering with your adjustment." Otis looked at her for a long moment. "Get him on the phone." "Mr. Hayes, family decisions about care protocols are made by the designated. Get him on the phone." Darren didn't answer. Otis tried 3 times from the common room phone before the staff told him his phone time was used up. He went back to room 214 and sat in the chair by the window. He sat there until dark. That night, the plan stopped forming in the back of his mind and moved to the front. There was a place he'd been working toward in secret for over a decade, carrying it in his chest the way Lenora carried his flannel shirt. He'd never told her about it, not because he wanted to keep it hidden, but because he wanted to give it to her finished. It started in the summer of 1968. 3 weeks after their wedding, Otis and Lenora were driving south through West Virginia on what they called their honeymoon, even though they couldn't afford a real one. They had his pickup truck, $80 between them, and a cooler of ham sandwiches. They were supposed to take the highway through Charleston, but Otis missed a turn, and they ended up on a 2-lane road that climbed through mountain country. The road wound past old farms and faded churches until it broke through the tree line and opened onto a valley. Lenora told him to stop the truck. He did. They stood at the edge of the road and looked down. The valley was narrow and green, with a creek running through it and a ridge of mountains behind. Halfway down the slope sat an old farmstead. Stone foundation, cedar shake roof gone to moss, a porch wrapping 2 sides. A barn stood behind it. One wall collapsed, and a stone wall ran along the property line where wildflowers grew through the cracks. "Otis," Lenora said. They walked down. The farmhouse was empty. Windows broken, door open, but the bones were solid. The stone foundation was 2 feet thick, laid by somebody who knew what they were doing. The porch boards were soft, but the joists were oak. They sat on that stone wall and ate ham sandwiches and watched the mountains turn gold in the late afternoon light. "Someday," Lenora said. "Someday what? We'll come back here. When the kids are grown and the mortgage is paid, we'll fix this place up and sit on this porch every evening." Otis smiled. Someday. They drove away the next morning and never went back. Life got busy. 3 children, 2 careers, 1 house that always needed something. The valley became a story they told each other late at night when the world felt too loud. "Remember that place? Remember those mountains? Someday." 15 years before Darren sold their house and filed them away in separate facilities, Otis saw a listing in the county auction bulletin. He subscribed to those notices as a hobby, scanning for cheap lumber and salvage material. But this one caught his eye for a different reason. 112 acres in Cedar Hollow, West Virginia. Tax delinquent. Unoccupied structure. Starting bid $4,000. Cedar Hollow. Otis remembered the name from the gas station where they'd stopped for directions all those decades back. He drove down on a Saturday without telling Lenora. Said he was pricing lumber in Wheeling. He found the property, walked it end to end, and confirmed it was the same place. The farmhouse was worse than he remembered. Roof partly caved on the south side, back porch collapsed entirely, but the stone foundation was still plumb. The well had water. The barn, minus the collapsed wall, was sound. He bid $4,200 and won. He paid cash from his woodworking savings, money Lenora knew about but never asked to count. He filed the deed in his name, put the property taxes on auto pay from a separate account, and started driving down every few months to work on the house. He told Lenora he was going to estate sales or lumber auctions, and she never questioned it because Otis had always done that. Over the years, he cleared brush, patched the roof with salvaged tin, got the chimney working again, replaced the worst of the porch boards. Slow work, a few days at a time, but the place was coming back. His plan was to finish it by their 60th anniversary. Drive Lenora down, walk her to the porch, and hand her the deed. The surprise of her life. Then his hip went bad. Then the children came with their brochures. And the deed ended up folded inside Otis's shoe, pressed flat against his sole, carried into that brick building in Akron while Darren counted the proceeds from the house on Buckner Street. 5 weeks after Darren cut the phone calls, the facility held a fire drill, standard procedure, every other month. The alarm sounded at 10 in the morning and staff guided residents to the assembly area in the side parking lot. Otis lined up with everyone else. He stood in the cold November air, leaning on his walker wearing his brown coat over his pajamas. The staff counted heads, checked rooms, radioed the all clear. Otis didn't go back inside. While the staff herded residents through the side entrance, he turned the other direction and walked through the parking lot to the street. His hips screamed at every step. He hadn't eaten properly in over a month, and his body was running on black coffee and stubbornness. But he kept walking. 6 blocks to the Greyhound station. He had $43 in his wallet. Money Janet had slipped him on her last visit for the vending machines. He bought a ticket heading south and sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours until the bus came. Nobody stopped him. Nobody looked twice. He was just an old man with a walker and a brown coat. People looked through him, the same way they looked through every elderly person standing alone in a public place. The bus pulled out of Akron at 12:15. By the time the facility noticed his bed was empty that evening, Otis was already across the state line, heading south through the hills of West Virginia with a deed in his shoe and 43 years of carpentry in his hands. The staff called Darren within the hour. They didn't call the police. Darren told them he'd handle it. 3 days later, Janet drove to Lenora's facility for a visit. She hadn't been in 2 weeks. She told herself it was work, the boys' schedules, the long drive to Scranton. The truth was simpler. She couldn't stand watching her mother disappear behind those medicated eyes. Janet found Lenora in the common room. The flannel shirt was pressed to her chest. A game show played on the television with the sound off. Lenora had lost weight. Her hair, which she'd always kept pinned and neat, hung loose around her face. "Mom," Janet said, sitting down across from her. "It's Janet." Lenora's eyes moved slowly. Recognition came, but it had to swim up through layers of medication and grief. "I brought you some things." Janet set a bag on the table. New socks, lotion, a magazine from the gas station. Small, useless gestures, and they both knew it. Janet sat with her mother for an hour. She talked about the boys, about work, about the weather turning cold. Lenora held the shirt and watched Janet's mouth move. Then, as Janet reached for her coat to leave, Lenora spoke, the first words she'd said in weeks. "Where is he? What is? Where is Otis? Where is Otis?" "He's at his facility, Mom, in Akron. You know that." Lenora's eyes sharpened. The fog cleared completely, and what was underneath was bright and fierce and wide awake. "They put us in separate boxes and expected us to keep breathing," Lenora said. "Breathing isn't living." Janet's hands trembled as she buttoned her coat. "I'll see what I can do about the phone calls, Mom, I promise." She drove home that evening feeling sick. She called Otis's facility the next morning to arrange a phone call, and the woman on the line paused. "Mr. Hayes is no longer with us," the nurse said. Janet's heart dropped. "What do you mean, no longer with you?" "He left the facility 3 days ago during a fire drill. We notified your brother. He asked us to hold off on involving the authorities while the family handled it." Janet called Darren immediately. "He walked out during a drill," Darren said, sounding more irritated than worried. "I've got people looking into it. He's 81 with a bad hip. He could be anywhere. He's stubborn. He's probably sitting in some diner feeling sorry for himself. I'll find him." Janet hung up and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone. She thought about her mother's face when the fog cleared. That look in her eyes, sharp, alive. The woman who'd taught third grade for 35 years and brokered peace between 6-year-olds and never backed down from a school board meeting. That woman was still in there. She'd just been buried under pills and silence in the absence of the only person who made her feel whole. That same night, while Janet sat in her kitchen trying to decide what to do, Lenora packed her bag, the flannel shirt, her medications, one change of clothes. She waited for the 11 o'clock shift change when the night staff arrived and the evening nurses gathered at the station to hand off reports. Lenora walked past them, through the common room, and pushed through the front door into the cold November air. The only home she knew was on Buckner Street in Canton. If Otis had gone anywhere, he'd gone there. So that's where Lenora headed, out into the dark, carrying his flannel shirt pressed against her ribs. Lenora made it to Canton on a Friday evening. She'd taken a bus from Scranton, then another from Youngstown, spending the last of the emergency money she kept tucked in the lining of her bag. $26 and a handful of coins that Otis had given her years ago. For just in case, he'd said. She'd never spent a penny of it until now. The bus dropped her at the downtown station after 9 at night. She walked the 12 blocks to their old street in the dark, her legs aching, the bag pulling at her shoulder. The neighborhood looked the same from a distance. Same trees, same sidewalks, same pattern of streetlights at the corners. Then she reached the house and stopped. The shutters were not green anymore. Someone had painted them black. A new mailbox stood at the curb, the modern kind with a curved top. The porch railing, the one Otis had carved by hand, had been replaced with a straight metal one from a hardware store. Through the front window, Lenora could see a young woman moving through the kitchen. Her kitchen, the kitchen where Lenora had cooked 10,000 dinners. Strangers lived in her house. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time. The wind came through her cardigan, and she didn't button it. "Lenora? Lenora Hayes?" A woman was crossing the lawn from next door, pulling a coat over her nightgown. The neighbor who'd lived in that house since the early 80s. "Honey, is that you? Come inside right now." The neighbor sat her at the kitchen table, made tea and toast, and draped a blanket across her shoulders. She asked no questions for 10 full minutes. Just let Lenora eat and get warm. "I went to the house," Lenora said finally. "It sold 2 months ago. Your son handled everything. A young couple from Cleveland bought it. I know. I just thought Otis might be there." "Otis? Why would he be here?" "He left his facility. I don't know where he went." The neighbor sat across from her. "Lenora, when did you last talk to him?" 5 weeks ago. Maybe 6. They stopped our calls. "And you came all the way from Pennsylvania alone." I walked out the front door. The neighbor studied her face. Lenora could see the woman deciding whether to treat her like a confused patient who needed to be sent back, or like a person who had made a decision. She chose right. "Guest room's upstairs. We'll figure the rest out in the morning." Lenora lay in the neighbor's guest bed, staring at the ceiling. Otis was gone. The house was gone. Their children had sold everything and scattered what was left. Where would he go? She turned the question over. He wouldn't go to Darren. He wouldn't go to Janet. He wouldn't check into a motel and sit. That wasn't Otis. Otis was a man who did things with his hands. If he'd walked out of that facility, he'd walked out of that facility, he'd walked out with a plan, and the plan would involve building something. Then it came to her, clear and sudden, like a light turning on in a dark room. The valley, 1968. Their honeymoon, the two-lane road through the mountains and the valley opening up below them, the stone farmstead with the porch on two sides, ham sandwiches on the stone wall. Someday, she'd said. What was the name of that town? Small town, barely a dot on the map. They'd stopped at a gas station for directions back to the highway. Cedar Hollow. That was it. If Otis had gone anywhere, he'd gone there. What Lenora didn't know was that Otis had already been there for 3 days. He arrived on a Tuesday evening after 9 hours on the Greyhound and a 7-mile walk from the county road. The walk nearly broke him. His hip seized twice and he had to sit on the gravel shoulder and wait for it to release. But the alternative was not going, and that was no alternative at all. The property looked worse than the last time he'd seen it, almost 2 years back, before the hip surgery and everything that followed. Brush had reclaimed most of the yard. The south section of roof he'd patched had lost its tin to a storm. The back porch was still collapsed. But the front 2 rooms were dry. The chimney drew clean. The well pump worked after 20 minutes of priming. Otis built a fire that first night from deadfall in the yard. He ate a can of soup he'd picked up at a gas station during the walk-in. He slept on the floor by the fireplace with his coat for a blanket and woke at dawn with every joint in his body locked stiff. Then he got to work. By the end of the first day, he'd cleared a path from the road to the porch, swept both usable rooms, and covered a broken window with plywood pried from the barn. His hands remembered what to do even when his body objected. By the second day, he'd walked into town. The general store sat on the main street of what barely qualified as a town. A post office, a church, a feed store that doubled as hardware in this place which had a lunch counter in the back and a woman behind it who looked like she'd been there since the building went up. "Help you?" she said. Bread, canned soup, and a box of 10-penny nails. She gathered the items, passing through. "No, ma'am." Staying. She looked at his hands, carpenter's hands, looked at his face, gaunt from weeks of not eating, looked at the walker. "You eating enough?" She asked. "I will be." She poured a cup of coffee and set it next to his groceries. "I'm Ruth. That one's on the house." "Otis. Thank you." He walked his supplies back up the road, slow and steady. The pain in his hip was still there, sharp and constant, but it meant something different now. In Akron, the pain had been a reminder of everything he'd lost. Here, it was just the price of doing what needed doing. On the third day, Otis was nailing a loose board on the porch when he heard footsteps on the gravel. He turned, hammer in hand. And there was Lenora. She was walking up the road in her blue cardigan, carrying the overnight bag. Her hair was loose, and her face was drawn from the travel. But her back was straight, and her eyes were clear, and she walked toward him, like she knew exactly where he'd be. Otis set the hammer down. He gripped the porch railing and just stood there. She reached the bottom of the steps and stopped. They looked at each other for a long time. 4 months of separation, 2 escapes, hundreds of miles traveled between them, and now 12 feet of porch steps. "You found it," she said. "I bought it," he said, "a long time ago. It was supposed to be a surprise." She looked at the farmhouse, the patched roof, the plywood window, the boards he'd been nailing. She looked past him at the valley, the creek, the mountains. "It is a surprise," she said. He came down the steps one at a time, gripping the railing. She didn't rush to help. She knew better. When he reached the bottom, she took his hand and held it. They stood in the yard together. 2 people in their 80s who had walked out of locked facilities, crossed state lines alone, and found each other in a valley they'd visited once on their honeymoon more than half a century ago. "The house needs work," Otis said. "It does. Roof's half gone. Back porch is collapsed. No hot water. Okay, I've got about $12 left. I've got 8. He looked at her. $20 and a farmhouse with no roof. "We've had worse," she said, and she almost smiled. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the last light leave the valley. Otis had built a fire in the fireplace, and Lenora had heated 2 cans of soup on the camp stove he'd rigged from a paint can and wire mesh. They ate on the steps, side by side. If you've made it this far into Otis and Lenora's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. For the first time in 4 months, Lenora could reach across and find Otis there. For the first time in 4 months, Otis could hear her breathing beside him. That was enough. That night, they slept on the floor by the fireplace, side by side under his coat and the flannel shirt she'd carried from Scranton. It was not comfortable. It was not warm enough. But they were together, and that changed everything. The next morning, a truck came up the gravel drive. A man in his early 30s climbed out wearing work boots and a canvas jacket. He had a toolbox in the bed and the look of somebody who worked with his hands for a living. "You folks know this place has been empty for years, right?" he called from the drive. Otis came to the porch. "It's not empty. I own it." The man looked at the house. Patched roof, plywood window, 81-year-old man with a walker standing on a half-rotten porch. "I'm Pete," the man said. "Pete Novak. Handyman, odd jobs, whatever needs doing. Saw chimney smoke yesterday and figured I should check it out. Otis Hayes, this is my wife, Lenora." Lenora appeared in the doorway. "Would you like some coffee? We don't have cream." Pete walked up and looked at the structure with a professional eye. "Mr. Hayes, no offense, but this house is rough. About 40% of a roof foundation exposed in the back, and I can see daylight through the east wall." "I know what's wrong with it," Otis said. "I've been working on it by yourself, until now." Pete looked at him, then at Lenora, then back at the house. "What's the plan?" Otis pointed at the caved-in section. "Roof first, then the east wall, then the back porch. That's 3 months of work minimum. You got materials, salvage from the barn, and $20. Pete ran his hand along the railing, testing the wood. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather was a carpenter," he said. "Raised me after my folks split up. He died when I was 16. He was building a cabin for his retirement, never got to finish it." He looked at Otis. "I'll come back tomorrow with lumber. I know a guy who is salvage cheap." "I can't pay you," Otis said. "I didn't ask you to." Pete came back the next morning with a truckload of salvaged lumber and a power drill. He and Otis worked on the roof while Lenora attacked the kitchen, scrubbing decades of grime from the counters with well water and rags she'd torn from an old bedsheet. Ruth drove up on the third day with a casserole, a bag of groceries, and a look that said she'd already heard the whole story. "Small town," she said, handing the food to Lenora. "Word moves fast. We're not charity," Otis called down from the roof. "Nobody said you were, but you're my neighbors now, and neighbors feed each other. That's how it works around here." Over the next 2 weeks, a rhythm took hold. Pete arrived every morning at 7 with materials. Otis directed and, when his hip allowed, worked alongside him. Lenora ran the interior, turning 2 bare rooms into something that felt like home. She found faded curtains in the barn, washed them in the creek, and hung them in the windows. She set wild flowers in a mason jar from the cellar on the kitchen table. Ruth kept them fed. Casseroles, bread, coffee, canned goods. She never asked for anything and she never lingered. A week in, Otis was fitting a window frame when Pete asked him something. "Why didn't you just stay at the facility? Most people your age would have." Otis drove a nail and didn't answer right away. "You don't retire from being somebody's person," he said finally. "Lenora needed me. I needed her. Everything else is details." Pete nodded slowly and handed him another nail. On a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after Otis and Lenora had arrived, a car came up the drive as the sun was going down. A sedan with a suitcase bungee corded to the roof. A man got out, mid-70s, thin, wearing a coat too light for November. He stood by the car with an expression Lenora recognized immediately. She'd seen it in the mirror the morning they packed up the house. Lost, scared, trying hard not to show it. "Can I help you?" Lenora called from the porch. The man took off his cap. "My name is Walter Odom. I read something on the internet about this place, about 2 people who left their nursing homes and came here. That would be us," Otis said, stepping to the door. Walter held his cap in both hands. "My daughter said the stairs in my house were too much for me. She moved me out and said she'd find me a place. Drove me to a rest stop on the turnpike, handed me $100, and told me she'd call when she had things figured out." He paused. "That was 3 weeks ago. She didn't call. Nobody spoke for a moment." "Have you eaten today?" Lenora asked. "No, ma'am. Come inside. We have soup on the stove, and there's a room in the back that just got a new window." Walter ate 3 bowls of soup that first night. He sat at the kitchen table with his cap on his knee and his hands wrapped around the bowl, and he didn't speak for a long time. When he finished, he looked up at Lenora with eyes that were wet but steady. "Thank you," he said. "You can stay as long as you need," Lenora told him. "The room in the back has a cot and a blanket. Pete put the window in yesterday." "Who's Pete?" "Our contractor," Otis said from the doorway. "He works for soup and conversation." Walter moved into the back room that night. He was quiet for the first few days, keeping to himself, washing his own dishes, making his cot with the precision of a man who'd been taking care of himself his entire life. He'd worked for the Postal Service for 37 years, walking the same route through the same neighborhood, until his knees wore out, and they gave him a desk job, then a retirement cake, then nothing. His daughter had sold his house while he was staying at her place temporarily. She'd listed it without telling him and used the proceeds to pay off her own mortgage. When Walter found out, she drove him to the Turnpike rest stop with $100 and a promise she never kept. She wasn't a bad person when she was young. Walter told Lenora one morning while they washed dishes at the kitchen sink. "I don't know when it changed. People don't change," Lenora said. "They just stop hiding." Walter looked at her. Then he dried the plate in his hands and set it carefully in the cabinet. "What can I do around here? Can you swing a hammer? I can learn." Over the next 3 weeks, more people found their way to the farmhouse. An elderly woman arrived on a Tuesday, carrying a garbage bag of clothes. Her son had moved to the coast and stopped returning her calls. She'd been staying in a church shelter until the shelter closed for renovations. Someone there told her about the couple in the valley. A week later, a married couple in their early 70s showed up in a pickup truck loaded with everything they owned. Their church had let them live in the parsonage for 2 decades. Then the new pastor wanted it for his family. They had a pension between them that covered food but not rent. They'd been sleeping in the truck for 11 days. Lenora gave them all rooms. The house had 4 usable bedrooms now. Thanks to Pete and Otis, working through November like the cold was just an inconvenience. The married couple took the upstairs room with the view of the mountains. The woman took the small room off the kitchen. A pattern formed. Mornings, everyone worked. Otis and Pete handled construction. Walter had turned out to be steady with a drill and willing to climb where Otis's hip wouldn't let him go. The woman from the church shelter took over the kitchen, producing meals from whatever Ruth sent up the hill. The married couple cleared brush and rebuilt the stone wall along the property line. Afternoons were quieter. People rested, read, or sat on the porch looking at the valley. Evenings, they ate together. Every night. 7 people around a table that Otis had built from barnwood in a single afternoon, sturdy and level, with a bench on each side. It was during one of those dinners that Lenora gave the place its name. "We need to call this something," she said, lading soup into bowls. "People keep asking what this place is." "It's a farmhouse," Otis said. "It's more than that, and you know it." Walter looked up from his bread. "What did you call it?" "When you first found this land." Lenora paused, the ladle in her hand. "Our someday place." "Then that's what it is," Walter said. "The someday house." Otis looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at the table full of people eating food that hadn't existed a month ago in a house that had been falling down 6 weeks earlier. "The someday house," she said. The name stuck. Lenora had changed in ways that surprised even Otis. At the facility in Scranton, the doctors had put her on medications for anxiety and early-stage cognitive decline. She'd slept 14 hours a day, couldn't remember what meal she'd just eaten, shuffled through hallways with her eyes half closed. Now, off the medication for 5 weeks, she was running a household of 7 people. She kept a schedule on the back of an old calendar Ruth had given her. Meals at 7, noon, and 6. Chores rotated daily. Garden planning on Sunday mornings. She organized supply runs into town, tracked what they needed, and kept a ledger of every donation in a spiral notebook. Her memory lapses had almost disappeared. She occasionally searched for a word or lost her train of thought mid-sentence. But those things happened to everyone her age. What she'd needed was not a pill regimen. What she'd needed was her husband, purpose, and people who expected her to show up every morning. Otis noticed it first. He told Pete about it one morning while they framed a wall for a 6th bedroom. "She's sharper than she's been in 2 years, Otis said. "Better than before the facility, even." "What do you think changed?" Pete asked. "She stopped being alone." Pete drove a screw and looked at him. "You know, you're pretty solid for a man who could barely stand when I met you. I'm better when I'm standing for a reason, Otis said. In early December, a reporter from the county newspaper drove up the hill. A woman in her 30s with a notepad and a phone camera. Ruth had told her about the couple who'd escaped nursing homes and were building a refuge for abandoned seniors. The reporter spent 2 hours at the house. She interviewed Otis and Lenora, talked to Walter and the others, took photographs of the rebuilt rooms and the garden. Lenora had started just a few raised beds so far, built from lumber scraps, but enough to show intention. "What made you do this?" the reporter asked Otis, sitting with him on the porch. "Do what? Leave the facility. Come here. Take in strangers." Otis thought about it. Nobody here is a stranger. They're people whose families forgot them, same as us. We just got tired of being forgotten. The article ran the following Thursday. Small piece in the county paper, page 6, with a photograph of Otis and Lenora on the porch. The headline read, "Elderly couple escapes nursing homes, builds refuge for abandoned seniors." Somebody posted it online. Within a week, it had been shared several thousand times. People left comments. Some sent donations, small amounts, $20, $50, a check for $200 from a woman in Virginia who said her father had died alone in a facility and she wished someone had done for him what Otis and Lenora were doing. Darren saw the article on a Monday morning. He was at his desk in Columbus drinking coffee and scanning his phone when his assistant forwarded the link with a note. "Isn't this your parents?" Darren read it twice. His face went white, then red. He called Janet first. "Have you seen this?" he said. "I saw it yesterday," Janet said quietly. "And you didn't call me? What would you have done?" "The same thing I'm about to do now. I'm driving down there." "Darren, they're fine. They're more than fine. They built something. They're living in a falling-down house in the middle of nowhere with strangers. Dad is 81 with a bad hip and Mom has cognitive issues. This is a liability nightmare. Her cognitive issues seem a lot better since she stopped taking those pills." Darren hung up on her. He arrived at the farmhouse on a Wednesday afternoon. 2 days later, driving a black SUV with a man in a gray suit in the passenger seat. A lawyer. Darren had come prepared. Pete was on the roof replacing shingles. Walter was splitting firewood at the side of the house. The couple from the parsonage were hanging laundry on a line. Pete had strung between 2 posts. Darren parked in the drive and got out. He looked at the property. The house was transformed from what it had been 8 weeks earlier. The roof was complete, the walls were solid, and smoke rose from the chimney. Lenora's raised garden beds lined the south side. A wooden sign by the road read, "The Someday House," in letters Otis had carved by hand. Darren walked past all of it without comment. Otis was inside at the kitchen table reviewing a list of supplies with Lenora. He looked up when the door opened. "Dad," Darren said. "Darren, this is Richard Hollis, an attorney. I can see that. What do you want? I want you to come home, both of you. This is over." Otis set down his pencil. "This is home. This is a condemned property in the middle of a valley in West Virginia, and you're running an unlicensed care facility with no staff, no insurance, and no oversight. This is a house where people live because they have nowhere else to go." Darren turned to Lenora. "Mom, be reasonable. You walked out of a medical facility. You need care." Lenora was sitting very straight in her chair. "I need care," she repeated. "Yes. Darren, I'm running a household of 7 people. I manage a budget, a schedule, and a garden. I cook 3 meals a day, and I haven't forgotten the stove once. What care, exactly, do you think I need?" Darren looked at the lawyer. The lawyer opened his briefcase. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, I've been retained to explore the possibility of a conservatorship hearing. Given your ages and medical histories, a judge may determine that you're unable to make decisions regarding your own welfare." Otis looked at the lawyer the way he looked at a piece of wood that wasn't worth cutting. Then he looked at Darren. "You want to put us in front of a judge? If I have to, then do it. Tell the judge that 2 people in their 80s walked out of locked facilities, traveled across state lines alone, rebuilt a house from nothing, and took in 5 people who had nowhere to go. Tell them we're incompetent. See how that sounds." Lenora stood up. "And while you're at it, tell him how you separated us. Tell him you put your father in Ohio and your mother in Pennsylvania because we had different care needs. Tell him you cut our phone calls because they were too emotionally destabilizing. Tell him you sold our house of 58 years to cover your development debts." The kitchen went silent. Walter, who'd come inside to wash his hands, stood frozen in the doorway. "That's not what happened," Darren said. "It's exactly what happened," Lenora said, "and you know it." Darren's jaw tightened. He looked at his mother, at the woman he'd filed away in a facility in Scranton, the woman the doctors said was declining, the woman who was standing in front of him now with her spine straight and her eyes sharp, and not 1 ounce of confusion in her voice. He turned to Otis. "You don't own this property, I do," Otis said. "Have for 15 years. Paid cash for my woodworking money. The deed is filed with the county recorder. Your lawyer can look it up." The lawyer already had his phone out. He looked up after a minute and nodded once at Darren. "The property is deeded to Otis R. Hayes. Free and clear." Darren stared at his father. "You bought this place? When?" "A long time ago. It was going to be my surprise for your mother. A retirement gift. Something I built for her. You never said anything. You never asked what I did with my time." Darren stood in the kitchen of the house his father had secretly bought, surrounded by people his parents had taken in, looking at a life he hadn't known existed. Otis watched him and waited for what would come next. "Home isn't a building, son," Otis said quietly. "Home is the person who knows your name in the dark. You took that away from us. We got it back." Darren opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the lawyer who was putting his briefcase back together with the expression of a man who knew this case was going nowhere. "We're leaving," Darren said. He walked out of the kitchen through the front door and down the porch steps without looking back. The lawyer followed. They were pulling out of the drive when a second car turned in. Janet's minivan, dusty from the highway. She parked beside Pete's truck and got out. She stood in the drive for a moment, looking at the house, the garden, the sign by the road. Then she walked up the steps. Lenora met her at the door. "Mom," Janet said. Her eyes were red. "I should have stopped this. I should have said no. I should have fought Darren from the beginning." "Come inside," Lenora said. Janet walked through the house slowly. She saw the kitchen table Otis had built, the wildflowers in a mason jar, the schedule on the back of the calendar. She saw Walter reading a book by the window. She saw the couple from the parsonage folding laundry together. She saw the bedroom doors, each one leading to a room that Pete and Otis had framed and finished by hand. She ended up in the garden, standing between the raised beds, looking at the small green shoots Lenora had started from seeds Ruth had given her. "You grew this," Janet said. "All of this." "We all did," Lenora said. "The doctors said you were declining. They said you needed constant supervision. The doctors saw a woman who'd been taken from her husband and locked in a room with pills. Of course I was declining. Anyone would." Janet's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry, Mom." Lenora took her daughter's hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." They stood in the garden together until the light began to fade. Then Lenora led Janet inside, sat her at the table, and set a bowl of soup in front of her. "Eat," Lenora said. "You look tired." Janet ate, and for the first time in months, Lenora watched one of her children sit at her table and share a meal. Janet stayed for 3 days. She slept in the small room off the kitchen, the one the woman from the church shelter had offered to share. She woke each morning before dawn and found Lenora already up, making coffee in the kitchen, going over the day's schedule by the light of a lantern because the east side of the house still didn't have working electricity. "You're up early," Janet said the first morning. "I'm always up early," Lenora said. "I've been getting up at 5:30 for over half my life. The facility tried to make me sleep until 8. That's not rest, that's storage." Janet poured herself a cup and sat at the table. "What can I do? There's a pile of donated clothes in the barn that needs sorting. Winter coats, mostly. Some of them are too worn to use, but most are fine. I can do that." Janet spent the morning sorting coats. She spent the afternoon helping Pete wire the east bedrooms. She ate dinner at the table with 7 other people and washed dishes at the sink beside Walter, who told her about his years walking the mail route, about the dogs he knew by name on every block, about the way the streets look different depending on the season. "You miss it," Janet said. "Every day," Walter said. "But I miss my daughter more, even after what she did." Janet dried a plate and set it in the cabinet without answering. She knew exactly what Walter meant. On her second night, Janet sat with Lenora on the porch after everyone else had gone to bed. The valley was dark except for a sliver of moon, and the air smelled like wood smoke and cold earth. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Darren." "I know," Lenora said. "You know what? I know he needed money. I know the house was about money." Janet looked at her. How did you know I was married to your father for 58 years, but I raised Darren for 18? I know my son. He's been running from something since he was a teenager. He just never stops long enough to figure out what. Janet was quiet for a while. His development company is in trouble. 2 big projects fell apart. He owes contractors, owes the bank. He owed nearly $200,000 when he came up with the plan to sell the house. The $320,000 from the sale covered his debts and left him enough to keep the business open. Lenora nodded slowly. And the nursing homes. The nursing homes were real. He really did think you needed care. But the separation, putting you and Dad in different states, that was about speed. He needed the house empty fast, and it was easier to process you separately than to find one facility for both of you. He told himself he was being practical. He was, Lenora said. Practical was always Darren's problem. He knows how to calculate. He never learned how to consider. Janet wiped her eyes. I should have stopped him, yes, but you didn't, and now you're here. Is that enough? Lenora reached over and took her daughter's hand in the dark. It's a start. Janet drove home on the 3rd day, promising to come back the following weekend. She kept that promise and the one after that. Over the next month, things at the farmhouse moved quickly. Ruth connected Otis and Lenora with a retired attorney from 2 counties over who specialized in nonprofit law. The man drove out on a Saturday, spent 4 hours reviewing the property deed, the donations they'd received, and the growing list of residents. He filed the paperwork to establish the Someday House as a registered nonprofit organization. The filing fee was waived because of the residents' income levels, which were 0 across the board. You need a board of directors, the attorney told them. At least 3 people. Otis, myself, and Ruth, Lenora said without hesitating. Ruth, who was standing in the kitchen refilling the coffee pot, turned around. I didn't agree to that. You've been feeding us for 2 months. You're already on the board. This just makes it official. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head and smiled. Fine, but I'm not going to any meetings. The legal structure gave them standing. Donations could now be tax deductible. Ruth put a collection jar on the counter at the store with a printed card explaining what the Someday House was. A church 2 towns over took up a special offering and sent $400 and 6 bags of winter clothing. A hardware chain in the next county donated paint and roofing nails after the manager's wife read the online article. Pete brought his own contribution. He'd been paying for lumber out of pocket for 2 months, never mentioning it, deflecting every time Otis tried to bring it up. But in January, he drove up with something different in the truck bed. A generator, used but working. Where'd you get that? Otis asked. Don't worry about it, Pete. A client was throwing it out. I asked if I could have it instead. Did you fix it yourself? Pete grinned. Took me 3 weekends. They had electricity in the east wing by the end of the week. Lenora plugged in a reading lamp in the common room, and Walter sat under it that evening, reading the newspaper aloud to anyone who wanted to listen. The woman from the shelter sat beside him mending a coat. The couple from the parsonage played cards at the kitchen table. Otis stood in the doorway watching them. 7 people, none of them related by blood, all of them discarded by the people who should have cared for them. Sitting in a room he built with his hands and Pete's help and lumber that was free because nobody else wanted it. What are you thinking? Lenora asked, coming up behind him. I'm thinking this is what I was building toward, all those trips down here over the years. I thought I was building a house. Turns out I was building this. By February, word had spread further than the county newspaper. A television station out of Charleston sent a crew to do a 3-minute segment. They interviewed Otis on the porch, Lenora in the garden, and Walter at the kitchen table. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening and was picked up by 2 national outlets the same week. The phone at Ruth's store, which Otis had listed as the contact number because the farmhouse didn't have a phone line, rang constantly. People wanting to donate, people wanting to volunteer, people asking if there was room for their mother, their father, their uncle who had nowhere else to go. Ruth bought a spiral notebook just for the messages. You started something, she told Otis when he came to town for supplies. We started something, he said. All of us. By the end of February, 10 people lived at the Someday House. Otis and Lenora Walter, the woman from the shelter, the couple from the parsonage, and 4 new arrivals who had come in January and February with their own versions of the same story. Different details, different cities, different children or systems that had failed them. But the shape of it was always the same. Someone had decided they were a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. Janet came every weekend now. She brought supplies, helped with repairs, and sat with Lenora in the evenings after the others had gone to bed. Their conversations were careful at first, circling the damage without quite touching it. Then, slowly, they started talking about other things. About Janet's sons, who were curious about their grandparents' new life. About Lenora's garden plans for the spring. About Otis's latest building project, a proper dining room addition that could seat 12. "He's building again," Janet said one Saturday, watching Otis and Pete frame the addition. "He looks 10 years younger. He's eating 3 meals a day," Lenora said, "and sleeping through the night. First time in 2 years. The doctors at Shady Oaks said he was in decline." The doctors at Shady Oaks saw an old man who wouldn't eat. They didn't ask why he wasn't eating. There's a difference. On a Saturday morning in early March, a car pulled into the drive that nobody recognized. A dark sedan, clean city plates. Darren got out. He didn't come to the door right away. He stood in the drive for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the house. The last time he'd been here, the roof was finished, but the walls were raw, and the garden was just lumber and dirt. Now the exterior was painted a warm gray. Window boxes sat on the front sills, empty still but ready for spring. The sign by the road had been freshened up, the carved letters filled with white paint. Pete was on a ladder replacing a gutter. He looked down, recognized Darren, and said nothing. Walter was sweeping the porch. He looked up, didn't recognize Darren, and nodded politely. Darren walked up the steps past Walter and around to the side of the house where Otis was sanding a porch railing he'd just installed. A new section of wraparound porch, extending the original around the south wall. Oak boards, properly joined, smooth under the sandpaper. Otis looked up. He didn't speak, he just looked at his son standing there in his city coat with his hands in his pockets and his face, carrying something he'd probably been carrying for months. "Need help?" Darren asked. Otis studied him for a long time. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a square of sandpaper. He held it out. Darren took it. He knelt beside his father and started sanding the railing, following the grain the way Otis had taught him when he was 12 years old, and they'd built a birdhouse together in the garage on Buckner Street. They worked in silence for over an hour. No apology, no explanation, no rehashing of what had happened, just two men sanding wood in the weak March sun while the sounds of the household carried through the walls behind them. When Darren stood up to leave that afternoon, Otis walked him to his car. "Come back next Saturday," Otis said. "I'm building a bookshelf for the common room." Darren nodded. He got in the car, pulled down the drive, and turned onto the county road. He'd come back. Both of them knew it. Spring arrived in the valley the way it always does in the mountains. Slowly at first, then all at once. The creek ran high from snowmelt. The wildflowers pushed through the stone wall. Lenora's garden, which she'd been planting on paper all winter, went into the ground in late March. Tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, lettuce. Enough to feed the house through summer if the rain cooperated. 14 people lived at the someday house now. The dining room addition was finished. A long room with windows on 3 sides, and the table Otis had built at its center, extended twice with leaves he'd made from the same barnwood. Every evening, 14 people sat down together and ate food they'd grown, or that Ruth had sent up the hill, or that some stranger 2 states away had mailed because they'd seen the story online and wanted to help. Pete had married a teacher from the school in the next town. They'd moved into a small house a mile down the valley road. He still came every morning, but now he brought his wife sometimes. She helped Lenora with the garden and taught Walter how to use a computer that someone had donated. Janet had rented an apartment 20 minutes away. She worked remotely 3 days a week and spent the other 2 at the farmhouse, handling the nonprofit paperwork, answering calls, coordinating volunteers who showed up on Saturdays to paint or garden or just sit with the residents and listen to their stories. Darren came back on Saturdays. Not everyone, but most. He sanded and painted and carried lumber and never spoke about what had happened. Otis didn't push him. Some repairs take longer than others, and the ones that matter most can't be rushed. On an evening in late April, old Otis and Lenora sat on the porch they'd rebuilt together. The original 2-sided wraparound was now a full surround running the entire perimeter of the house, wide enough for chairs and a table and the rocking bench. Pete had built them as a housewarming gift. The valley was green below them. The creek caught the last of the sun. Inside, someone was setting the table for dinner. Walter's voice drifted through the open window, reading something aloud. Probably the newspaper. Probably to nobody in particular, but that had never stopped him. Otis, Lenora said. Was it worth the wait? He looked at her. At the woman he'd married when they were both young enough to think the world was simple. At the woman who'd taught 30 years of third graders to believe in themselves, who'd raised 3 children and survived the worst one of them could do, who'd walked out of a locked facility and crossed 2 states to find him. Every day, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The porch light came on behind them, warm and steady, and the sound of dinner being made filled the house. A car turned up the gravel drive, an old station wagon with a woman behind the wheel, maybe 70, maybe older, driving slowly with both hands on the wheel. She parked and sat for a moment, looking at the house, at the sign, at the porch where 2 people sat together in the evening light. Then she got out and walked to the steps, carrying a small bag. Lenora straightened up. "Can I help you?" The woman held the bag with both hands. "I heard about this place. My son says I can't live alone anymore, but the facility he picked..." She trailed off. "Is it true you take people in?" Lenora looked at Otis. Otis looked at the woman. "Have you eaten?" Lenora asked. "Not since this morning. Come inside. There's a chair at the table." The woman climbed the steps. Lenora held the door open for her. Inside, the house was warm and bright and full of people who'd once been forgotten, and now were home. They never spent another night apart.